All right, welcome back, my APUSH people. We have a really cool chapter today, chapter 22. We're getting there, okay, little by little. And this chapter covers the 1920s, and the 1920s are a lot of people's favorite subjects or topics in U.S. history because there's a lot of really cool trends that are going on in the 1920s, as is some more modern things going on as well. So we will have time to talk about all the cool and wonderful things and what makes the 1920s so great and wonderful and obscure and different than every topic we've talked about thus far. But we also have to talk about some things that people don't know about or typically talk about or think about when they think about the 1920s. So let's pick up after the end of World War One. Now, if you remember at the end of World War One, things are a little bit different. There's a lot of controversies with, the United States and not joining the League of Nations. If you remember the controversy from last year with an AP World, where Russia, in the middle of World War One, had decided to drop out of the war because of their own Bolshevik revolution and how, Tsar Nicholas is killed and, you see Vladimir Lenin take power. So all that is going on. And if you remember, though, as well, that revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, was really a worldwide revolution, right? It was supposed to be workers of the world unite, not just Russia. And, in thinking of all that, it scares Americans, okay? It scares a lot of people in America that it is or is supposed to be a worldwide revolution. And that is going to lead us to what's called the Red Scare in the 1920s. Now, the Red Scare, red is what we associate, the color we associate with communism. And why are people so scared? Because they're scared that, this revolution can make its way to America, okay, and possibly topple our government, and we could be another government that could fall to communism. Because Russia is a pretty big country, obviously very well established throughout history, and if they are able to fall to communism, it pretty much opens the door to anybody. So this Red Scare, let's talk about it. Now, the Red Scare, it makes its way to America really because it's heightened, it's hysteria that really allows us to feel fully consumed by this fear that communism is taking us over. Well, does anything happen to allow people to be that scared, or is it just hearsay? Well, no, there are actually a couple of events that do allow the Red Scare and its hysteria to grow tremendously. Now, there's plenty of strikes going on in America, as there always are, but strikes are are not a good are not a good don't go well with the people, I should say. Okay, and things like the steel strike in 1919, the Boston police strike in 1919, these strikes are shutting down major industries. And the thing is, a lot of these unions are calling for more government control. Okay, the government to get involved and take over basic industries. Now, socialism, communism, you are going to see the state take over industries, and that's kind of what they're calling for. Now, on top of that, you see politicians getting bombs in the mail. And, this leads people to believe that, democracy as we know it is coming to a halt. It's crumbling. You see that workers want, socialism, and the government is in danger of being toppled. Their lives are being threatened because of these bombings. Well, the United States is okay. We can't have this, obviously. And so the Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer, this guy on the slide right there, he's going to lead a series of raids in what's called the Palmer raids to basically investigate and infiltrate, the leaders of all these groups, okay, to make sure we don't have this fall of communism. Okay, so the Red Scare, there you go. That's, a basic definition. This is also going to allow us or lead us to restricting people to coming here from other countries. So we have new immigration laws. Now remember, this is not the first immigration law we've ever had. Think back in time, we saw the Chinese Exclusion Act all the way back in 1882, in which excluded the Chinese. Well, now on top of that, you have a couple of new immigration laws really caused by this Red Scare. And the quota system is going to set maximum amount of people coming to our country from various places. Okay, and what a quota is, it's usually a number. Okay, once we hit that quota, that maximum number, okay, this country's cut off. Okay, so that is just one of our immigration laws that we have. Another immigration law is the National Quota Act of 1924. So this is a second one, 3 years later than the original we just talked about. This is going to set a limit at 2% of the immigrants allowed into the United States by 1890. So what does this mean? What they're doing is they're looking at the census from 1890 and they're saying, okay, let's say 100 immigrants came from Italy in 1890. Only 2% now are allowed into the country from here on out. Okay, and 2%, out of 100 would be only 2 Italians. So that's a very small amount. Obviously, there was probably more than 100 Italians coming in 1890, but I'm just using that as an example. Okay, why are we doing this? We're obviously trying to limit the amount of new immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. As we've talked about in the past, new immigrants are coming here with less backgrounds in our language and also our system of government. Okay. We also are going to severely restrict more Asian immigrants. As we've talked about in the past, we just mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, but also, okay, we've seen this racism against the Asian immigrants in the West Coast when we talked about Teddy Roosevelt last week. But now, okay, we are not going to allow any Japanese immigrants at all. This is also going to anger Japan because after World War I, we kind of snubbed them with the Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Versailles, my apologies. But now on top of that, they don't get anything out of the World War I, and they're not allowed into America. Okay, so this is, as you can see, only going to keep angering the Japanese as we head into World War II. All right, so this rise of nativism, that's not cool. This is a huge theme in the 1920s that is largely overlooked. Okay, so if you want to talk about the ultimate example of nativism in the 1920s, it really culminates with this Sacco and Vanzetti case. And I would definitely know this case because it shows up on the exam a good amount. So who are Sacco and Vanzetti? They're two Italian immigrants who work for a shoemaker up in Massachusetts. Their boss in 1921 is found murdered. So everybody points the finger at Sacco and Vanzetti who worked here. Why? Well, one, they're immigrants, okay, and Americans, as we know, are incredibly nativist. Two, they're anarchists, okay, they don't support any type of government. They're not a pro-democracy, okay, and also number three is they were draft dodgers during World War I. This means that they promoted people and promoted the idea of people trying to dodge the draft, okay, not get drafted. And so they themselves, okay, were not drafted to war. Now, they were found guilty, both executed in 1927. In hindsight, there was no evidence that these guys actually broke the law or murdered their boss, that they pulled the trigger. So you want to talk about the ultimate price, okay, you want to talk about nativism. All right, these two guys right here, Sacco and Vanzetti, they fell victim to nativism, the Red Scare, the prejudice. This was like, your culmination of all these bad things, and these poor guys were put to death. At the time, it seemed as if, these guys had to have done it, but in retrospect, there was zero evidence they actually did it. Now, another trend of the 1920s, okay, you want to talk about nativism and prejudice, okay, the KKK comes back once again. You say, wait, what, the KKK? Yeah, now the KKK, remember, they first were developed after the Civil War because of their hatred of African Americans. Well, now in the 1920s, you see almost a rebirth, if you will, or an emergence of more KKK members, okay, a resurgence. Why? They add on to their hate list. Okay, so from the beginning, it's always been, they're so anti-African American, but now they add on other groups like immigrants, Catholics, and radicals, okay, like anarchists, for example. And Americans, as we know, are pretty nativist, okay, they're pretty prejudiced against these other groups, so it makes sense. And so you are going to see an increase in membership of the KKK. America's first, and here's a real kicker. America's first popular film ever was The Birth of a Nation in 1915. The Birth of a Nation, okay, and that's the cover of it right there on the top of the slide, is all about the KKK and how they, get rid of or kick out, the bad guys, the immigrants, if you will, and the good guys in the film are the KKK. All right, and Americans love this film. It was the first major film in our country's history, and it was such a racist film. And even parts of it were filmed at the White House, but Woodrow Wilson claimed to have not known that they were filmed there. Anyways, as you can see, it just only continues to lead to this idea that Americans are nativist, we are racist, we are prejudiced, which is not good, okay? But the KKK brands themselves as being the patriotic people that are going to rid our country of those who are unpatriotic, un-American, if you will. Okay, let's get to some good stuff because a lot of that was some downer stuff. Let's talk about, all the fun stuff that people really like the 1920s for. So America heading into the Roaring 20s. Okay, remember World War I's over, war is over. We're going to focus back on ourselves. We said at the end of last chapter, we're going back to an isolationist idea or foreign policy. And we're going to see a lot of industries booming. We're going to see the rise of automobiles and new technology like the radio. We're going to see some jazz. We're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. All right, there's a lot of cool things to talk about in the 1920s, and that's exactly why people like it. But at the same time, the economy is booming. It's doing well, or so we think. Our spending increases. People, have jobs. There's pretty much no unemployment. There's all these new inventions, these gadgets that people want to buy up. Here's some examples right here. You have the fridge, you have the iron, the vacuum cleaner, the toaster, the radio, sewing machine, the stove, the oven, the washing machine. These are all fancy new gadgets that people are buying for their homes, and people are excited about this stuff. And it only leads, all this new technology leads to 1920s being the rise in the consumer era, and also a rise in enthusiasm and patriotism, within America that we're doing really good, okay? But here's a problem. People are able to buy all these new fancy gadgets, but because of a certain idea, and that's called the installment plan. You say, what are you talking about, Mr. Muller? What I'm talking about is people are able to buy these new gadgets because of this installment plan. You say, what's the installment plan? It's actually something you've heard of before, and you probably used it actually in your life. It's credit. Okay, it's a buy now, pay later. Okay, now you think about the dangers of credit. Okay, think about the dangers of putting something on a credit card, the dangers of actually not paying full price, right now for it. You can buy, but if you really don't have the money to pay back, well, that could be a real problem. And that is going to happen, as we know, very shortly. Okay, so that installment plan, is going to have some serious implications later on as we head into the Great Depression. So stay tuned for that. So all this, buying, the economy is roaring, it's doing well. We have to obviously understand that the underlying issues are that people buying things on the installment idea or plan. People are also buying stocks on the same idea. It's called buying on the margin. What does buying on the margin mean? Buying on the margin means, okay, I'm going to buy a stock, but I don't have money for the stock. So I'm going to tell my stockbroker, I'm going to say, hey, listen, can you front me the money to buy that stock for Apple next week? And when I make my money, I'll pay you back. Great idea. Problem is, if that stock doesn't make money, well, now I owe my stockbroker, and now my stockbroker also owes money to the stock market, okay, to that company. And you can see the domino effect that's about to happen as we head towards, as we steamroll really towards that Great Depression. So again, this idea that the economy is roaring, it's not really true, okay? It's all based upon a lie. It's all based upon credit, okay, which is not good. All right. So consumer goods, okay, installment buying, buying stocks on the margin. Keep all this in mind as we're heading towards, okay, the ultimate, Armageddon, if you will. What else is going on? That's some cool stuff to talk about. Well, the 18th Amendment was passed, okay? We finally, since the 1840s, that antebellum era, those women, okay, the religious leaders who've been fighting for temperance, they finally get their amendment, which is a national law that says prohibition. You can't buy, sell, or consume alcohol. It is illegal. Well, that's going to have a lot of effects now. You're going to see people not so willing to give up the drink, and so you're going to see the creation of speakeasies, which, like this picture right here on the left, is underground or secretive bars where people can go and drink. Bootleggers are also going to be a byproduct of this 18th Amendment. People that are going to smuggle liquor from one place to the other. Okay, and there are some famous bootleggers that I'm sure you've heard of before. All right, so the most famous bootlegger out of this time is Al Capone there in that picture. Al Capone is pretty much your first American gangster, if you will. Organized crime becomes very widespread during this era, mainly because they are the ones in charge of trying to smuggle alcohol from Europe and obviously get it to those speakeasies. So Al Capone, he becomes your, first, mobster, and he will be very successful, and he will also be arrested eventually, and he will die in jail. All right, but Al Capone, as you can see there, at one time, person of the year, and then has his big downfall for tax evasion. Okay, so pay your taxes, people. Make sure you don't try to bamboozle the government. All right, so let's get to some other cool stuff. Okay, some other terms to know. Women, what's going on with them? You see the rise of the flappers during this time. What's a flapper? Well, women, think about World War One. Women had entered the workforce, okay, at mass amounts and numbers for the first real time. Yeah, we've had women in the workplace before, but now you saw a lot more women enter the workplace during World War One, taking the jobs of the men. Now, war is over. Some women are still able to hold their jobs, and now that they have some money in their pockets, they're thinking about, continuing to, have a good time and, not settle down and start a family right away. You're going to see a lot of women want to go out and, go to clubs and, drink in public, and you see a lot of new fashions with women during this time period as well. Short dresses, short hair, high heels, makeup, and lipstick, and kind of just like an emancipated or rebellious young woman who is embracing, these urban attitudes of the day and promoting all these cool new dances that are going on in the clubs. And so, flappers are a product of World War One, really because that women had entered the workforce, and also you have to remember they feel so emancipated as well because they finally have suffrage. Okay, that 19th Amendment is final. Okay. Other things going on, you also have women like Margaret Sanger, who takes on the very controversial idea of birth control. This is something that is, very revolutionary for the 1920s. It's really something you didn't talk about. Margaret Sanger takes on the idea that women should have the right, okay, to birth control, and so she becomes popular for that amongst women. But as far as music goes, okay, the real music of the day becomes jazz. And all these dances and jazz really popularized, okay, the Harlem Renaissance, which we'll mention in a moment. What else is going on? You have a lot of contests during the 1920s. You have some American heroes that are born out of contests. One of the big contests of the day was to fly a plane from nonstop from New York to Paris nonstop and across the Atlantic, no less. The first person to do that is this guy right here, Charles Lindbergh. He becomes a big national hero for doing this. He wins the prize I just spoke about, and he paves the way for a lot more pilots down the road. Okay, and women, for example, like Amelia Earhart. Okay, as well. But Charles Lindbergh becomes a very very popular person in the 1920s for Americans because of this contest he wins, and he also gets involved into some politics stuff. But what else? Henry Ford and his Model T becomes the popular car of the day in the 1920s. We've mentioned in the past it's produced a little bit quicker and cheaper, which makes the Model T be more affordable for everyday people. That assembly line is responsible for that. And we talked about as far as Charles Lindbergh as well, him and his plane there. Sports, okay. In the 1920s, baseball becomes America's pastime. You have guys like Babe Ruth, who really puts baseball on the map, and all the home runs that he is accredited with really gets a lot of people involved in baseball. The Negro Leagues are becoming very popular as well. This guy in the bottom left there, Andrew Rube Foster, kind of your Babe Ruth of the Negro Leagues, and sports are, dominating people's leisure time during the 1920s. You see the rise of Hollywood. Okay, Hollywood becomes, you know, um, the the landmark to for filming and for movies. Really, actually called Hollywood Lands, but they'll change the name after the Great Depression. The radio is able to broadcast all these sports and what's going on with news and things like that. You see the introduction of Disney World. That's also brand new. So all of these things are going on concurrently, and you see a lot of people spending their leisure time in sports or listening to the radio every day for their programs or for those sports, going to watch a movie. The movie industry has come a long way since those clips I showed you a couple weeks ago. The Jazz Singer, for example, becomes the first talkie. A talkie is a movie with people actually talking. Okay, now there's sound. Okay, and this was a big deal in 1927. So celebrity culture is rising. Okay, radio movies are dominating. Other sports that become very popular, tennis. Helen Willis is a very popular tennis star at this time. She wins 7 U.S. Open titles and 8 Wimbledon titles. If you know anything about tennis, that's a big deal. Swimming, this lady on the bottom left here in the slide, Gertrude Ederle, swims across the English Channel at the age of 19. The English Channel is no small body of water, and so she does it. Again, another contest, just kind of crazy. A new sport that is created because of bootlegging is NASCAR. What used to happen? So when we were talking about bootleggers before with Prohibition, a lot of the times the alcohol would come in from Europe to places like Montauk. Okay, we'll keep it on Long Island, and the European liquor would come into Montauk, and in the middle of the night, the bootleggers would have to get that alcohol from Montauk to New York City, but they had to outrun the cops. So what they would do is they would soup up the engines, make the cars as fast as possible, and get from Montauk to New York City to outrun the police. And that stock car racing and racing cars leads to the rise of the modern day sport of NASCAR. All right, and so that's something cool that happens because of bootlegging. Now, the Harlem Renaissance is also another really cool mini topic within the 1920s itself. And this is a reflowering of African American culture in the 1920s. It occurs in Harlem in New York City. It's caused by the Great Migration. If you remember back to last chapter, the Great Migration was the movement of over 400,000 African Americans from the South, the Jim Crow South, to the North during World War I and a little bit afterwards because of jobs and job opportunities. And because all these African Americans are moving up to the north in places like Harlem, you're going to see, this new culture emerge, and a lot of famous performers and artists, okay, they're going to partake in the Harlem Renaissance. So here's some famous people from the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, the most famous writer as a product of the Harlem Renaissance is Langston Hughes. That's this guy on the slide right here. Langston Hughes is used a lot on the exams, so excerpts or poems by Langston Hughes are very popular. What did he write about? He wrote about living in a white-dominated society, which is something that African Americans obviously are dealing with, not just in the 1920s, but in general, but becomes a very, very popular writer. Other people that become popular in the 1920s, performers, okay, like Roland Hayes and Paul Robeson, who will become popular in places like the Cotton Club, which was a club for African Americans in New York City. Um, Jazz performers, okay, jazz, where does it come from, first of all? Its our origin is from New Orleans, but remember the transplanting of African Americans from the South to the North, the Great Migration, allows jazz to also make its way to New York. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, okay, these guys are very popular performers for jazz in the 1920s. You want to talk about the music of the 1920s, it's jazz. Okay, the beginning credits here when I was opening up this video, okay, that was jazz for you, 1920s jazz. Now, speaking about, Black America in the 1920s, there is one thing that you definitely need to know, and this guy, Marcus Garvey, the guy on the slide right here, he becomes popular for founding the United Negro Improvement Association, in which he comes up with the idea that African Americans should, separate themselves from white America and actually go back to Africa. Now, this is not so revolutionary because we talked about something like this before. If you remember back to 1820s, okay, about 100 years earlier, President James Monroe had suggested the same thing. Okay, they set up Monrovia, or what was called Liberia, in which slaves would go back or be sent back to free slaves, that is, go back to Africa, and it was not really successful. Marcus Garvey says, they probably should do this. It's called black separatism, that they should separate themselves from white America because white America is unable to give or promote equality for all Americans. And so Marcus Garvey comes up with this idea. He's going to lend this idea, or this idea is going to be also taken by a person in the future in the 1960s by a civil rights activist named Malcolm X. All right, so I would know the idea of black separatism, and I would know this guy Marcus Garvey. Okay. Finally, one of the last things to talk about is a big trial, a controversial trial in the 1920s. It's called the Monkey Trial or the Scopes Trial. This guy, John Scopes, he's a biology teacher in Tennessee. He is brought to court because he is teaching his students the theory of evolution, the theory that we evolved from monkeys. And the people in Tennessee, and most Americans during this time, did not agree with that. They believe or they teach the idea of the theory of creation, that, God created all of us. This is a true example of fundamentalism, that Americans want their kids, learning the belief of religion and that it's more important than science. This John Scopes is being very controversial and trying to do the opposite. Long story short, they will tell John Scopes he is not allowed to teach the theory of evolution, and that for now our traditional values, okay, our fundamentalist beliefs are going to be the ones that are going to continue to be taught to our children. And this trial was widespread. It was controversial not just in Tennessee but across America, and its findings and the steps of the trial were followed by many because of the radio all across the country. All right, so poor John Scopes. Finally, closing this all out, okay, a lot of people are in the 1920s. We said, why are we reverting back to ourselves and, focusing on ourselves as a country? You see a lot of sadness in what they call the lost generation, criticizing the ideas of why we fought in World War One, and how we should really, go back to our foundations and teach our children the fundamentalist ideas, and remember that we're a small town, kind of country, and rejecting some of the materialism that the decade has produced. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Sinclair Lewis write about this. And those are pretty well-known authors, but The lost generation just refers to all those, okay, that died and perished in World War One, and maybe we're kind of getting away from ourselves, and we definitely need to go back and remember who we are as Americans, and that's really why the 1920s are maybe such a great time in America, because we kind of were focused on ourselves and trying to better ourselves as a society. But as we'll find out next week, that wasn't entirely true, but that's a story for next week. All right, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully this helped you in your preparation for the 1920s, chapter 22. If you like this video, give it a like or subscribe. Other than that, peace out and see y'all next week.